On February 16, 1495, the richest man in England knelt on the cold dirt of Tower Hill. There were no speeches and no glory, just the heavy swing of the executioner's axe. In a split second, Sir William Stanley went from being the realm's untouchable power broker to a headless corpse discarded in the open. It was a messy, lonely end for a man who once held the fate of the country in his pocket. The sickest irony is that his death warrant was signed by King Henry VII. Only 10 years prior, amidst the blood and mud of Bosworth, it was Stanley who physically picked the crown out of a hawthorn bush and placed it on Henry's head. He made the king, and the king killed him. It is a cold reminder of how politics actually works. Saving a ruler's life yesterday offers zero protection against his paranoia today. The England into which William Stanley was born was defined by suffocating dread. The mid-15th century was not a time of pageantry or chivalry. The 100 Years' War with France had collapsed. This failure sent thousands of unemployed violent soldiers flooding back onto English shores. The government was bankrupt. Laws were ignored. Even the king, Henry VI of the House of Lancaster, offered no stability. He was a pious man, yet mentally infirm, drifting in and out of catatonic stupors. In this power vacuum, the great noble families of England turned on each other like wolves in a shrinking cage. The houses of York and Lancaster began a dance of death that would become known as the Wars of the Roses. It was a time when a man could wake up a lord and go to sleep a headless corpse. Loyalty was not a virtue, it was a liability. Survival required a specific kind of genius, a cold, fluid adaptability that viewed honor as a luxury the dead could afford. No family mastered this dark art better than the Stanleys of Lancashire. The Stanleys were the undisputed kings of the Northwest. From their stronghold at Latham House, they looked out over a private kingdom comprising Lancashire and Cheshire. These were wild, unruly lands far from the prying eyes of London, filled with hard men who owed allegiance to the Stanley eagle before the English crown. The family's unofficial doctrine was simple: wait. While other families, the Percys, the Nevilles, the Cliffords, threw themselves into the meat grinder of civil war with passionate idealism, the Stanleys sat on the fence. They watched, they calculated, they committed their forces only when the winner was mathematically certain. William Stanley, born around 1435, was the second son of Thomas Stanley, the first Baron Stanley. As a second son, William occupied a precarious position. He did not stand to inherit the title or the vast bulk of the estates. That was the destiny of his elder brother, the future second Lord Thomas Stanley. This birth order forged two very different personalities. Thomas grew up to be the ultimate politician, slippery, cautious, silence incarnate. William, however, had to fight for his place in the world. He was the soldier, the man of action, possessed of a fiery, reckless streak that the rest of his family lacked. While Thomas sat in council chambers whispering in corners, William was in the saddle, feeling the weight of a lance and the adrenaline of the charge. To understand the man, one must look at his ambitions. William was not content to be merely the spare heir. He possessed a hunger that his brother lacked, a desire not just for safety, but for personal glory and tangible power. While Thomas was the shield of the family, protecting their ancestral lands, William became the sword, carving out a new destiny. He was charismatic where Thomas was dull, and decisive where Thomas was hesitant. It was this specific volatility, this willingness to gamble everything on a single charge, that would make him so dangerous to his enemies, and eventually to himself. History often lumps the Stanley brothers together as a single political unit, but in the early years of the Wars of the Roses, William broke the family mold. He did not want to sit on the fence. He believed in the cause of the House of York. The pivotal moment came in 1459 at the Battle of Blore Heath. The tension between the incompetent Lancastrian government and the challenger Richard, Duke of York, had snapped. Armies were marching. The Stanley forces were summoned by the Lancastrian Queen Margaret of Anjou to stop the Yorkist army. Thomas Stanley did what Stanleys do. He marched his army to within 6 miles of the battlefield and then simply stopped. He sent letters to both sides claiming he couldn't fight due to illness or confused orders. He was waiting to see who would win. William Stanley did not wait. Defying his family's cautious nature, William took his personal retinue and rode hard to join the Yorkist Earl of Salisbury. He committed high treason against the reigning King Henry VI. At Blore Heath, William fought with a ferocity that distinguished him from his brother. When the Yorkists won the day, William was knighted on the field, but the victory was short-lived. The Yorkist lords fled England shortly after, and the vengeful Lancastrian Parliament passed an Act of Attainder against them. For the first time, William Stanley was a wanted man. He was stripped of his rights, his lands declared forfeit, and his blood corrupted. He was an outlaw. This experience, the stinging humiliation of attainder, would leave a scar on his psyche. It taught him that being on the losing side meant total ruin. It was a lesson he would never forget, and one that would eventually dictate his fatal choices at Bosworth. The wheel of fortune turned again in 1461. The Yorkist Edward IV crushed the Lancastrians at the horrific Battle of Towton, a battle fought in a blinding snowstorm, where the rivers ran red with the blood of 28,000 men. William Stanley fought there, hacking through the blizzard for the White Rose. With Edward IV secure on the throne, William's loyalty was rewarded with an avalanche of wealth. This is the period where William Stanley transforms from a younger brother into a Tycoon of the North. King Edward IV realized that to hold the lawless North, he needed men like William Stanley. He showered him with offices: Chamberlain of Chester, Sheriff of Flintshire, and Constable of the castles of Carnarvon and Beaumaris. But the greatest prize came in the form of Skipton Castle. This vast estate had belonged to the butcher Clifford, a Lancastrian lord who had killed the king's brother. Edward IV stripped the Cliffords of their ancestral home and gifted it to William Stanley. Suddenly, Sir William was the richest commoner in England. He was wealthier than most earls and dukes. He began to build, to expand, and to hoard. He transformed Chirk Castle into a magnificent residence. He started accumulating a private treasury that became the stuff of legend: barrels of gold coin, tapestries of silk, and plate of solid silver. But money was not the only currency in the 15th century. Influence was the true coin of the realm. To secure this influence, William made a strategic move in his personal life that is often overlooked: his marriage. He did not marry for love, he married for dynastic solidification. He wed Elizabeth Hopton, a woman of significant standing. More importantly, she was the widow of John Tiptoft, the Earl of Worcester, a man known as the Butcher of England for his brutal execution methods. By marrying Tiptoft's widow, William absorbed not just her lands, but the dark prestige of the Yorkist inner circle. This marriage was a statement. It signaled that William was not just a provincial soldier from Lancashire. He was integrating himself into the highest, most ruthless echelon of the English aristocracy. He was building a legacy that could rival his brother's. William's management of Chirk Castle and Holt Castle offers a window into his personality. He was not merely a warrior. He was a man of exquisite, perhaps even obsessive taste. He poured money into these fortresses, turning grim defensive structures into palaces fit for royalty. He commissioned the finest glass, imported the richest velvets, and built a personal armory that was the envy of the nobility. He was constructing a personal brand, a statement to the world that while he might not have a peerage title like his brother, he possessed a princely magnificence that could outshine anyone. He was a man who enjoyed the tangible weight of success, the clink of gold, the texture of silk, and the terrified respect of his tenants. This respect was often born of fear. In his role as Chamberlain of Chester and Sheriff of Flintshire, William Stanley was not a benevolent administrator. Records suggest he was a hard, rapacious landlord. He squeezed the Welsh and English tenants alike, extracting every penny of rent and tax due to the crown, and to himself. He was known to exploit legal loopholes to seize property and punish dissenters. In the rough borderlands of Wales, he was the law, and his word was iron. This ruthless administrative streak proves that William was not just a battlefield commander. He was a cold, efficient bureaucrat who understood how to monetize power. We see this ruthlessness clearly in the Chester Mills incident, a detail often omitted but vital to understanding his character. William Stanley, driven by profit, ordered the construction of a massive weir dam across the River Dee to power his corn mills. This construction was aggressive and selfish. It destroyed the local fishing industry and caused flooding in the city of Chester, ruining the livelihoods of common citizens. The city corporation begged him to remove it, but Stanley refused. He cared more for the grinding of his grain than the welfare of the city he was supposed to protect. He was a man who viewed the landscape itself as a tool for his own enrichment, displaying an arrogance that would eventually make him believe he was above the king himself. In the 1470s, King Edward IV gave William a role that was far more intimate than a sheriff or a constable. He appointed William Stanley as steward of the household to the Prince of Wales. The Prince of Wales was the king's eldest son, the future Edward V. He was a boy being raised at Ludlow Castle on the Welsh marches. William Stanley lived with this boy. He ate with him, watched him train with wooden swords, and oversaw his education and safety. This is a crucial, often overlooked psychological detail. William Stanley was not just a remote political supporter of the House of York. He was a father figure to its future. He watched the young prince grow from a toddler into a bright, promising teenager. He served the boy's mother, Queen Elizabeth Woodville. He was embedded in the inner circle of the Yorkist family. This period solidified a deep emotional attachment that would later prove to be William's undoing. He was a bachelor for much of this time, before his late marriage, and it is possible he transferred his paternal instincts onto the young prince. Unlike the cutthroat politics of London, life at Ludlow was structured around the protection and nurturing of this boy. William's honor became intertwined with the safety of Edward V. He was not just guarding an heir, he was guarding a child he had known since infancy. This personal connection explains why the later events of 1483 were not just a political shift for William, but a gut-wrenching personal tragedy. For over a decade, life was good. The Wars of the Roses seemed to be over. England was stable, wealthy, and at peace under the tall, charismatic King Edward IV. William Stanley sat atop a mountain of gold, secure in the knowledge that when the king died, the young boy he had helped raise would ascend the throne, and William's position would be unassailable. But the one thing the Stanleys could not control was mortality. In April 1483, disaster struck. King Edward IV, a man of immense physical appetites, who had grown fat and lethargic in his later years, died suddenly at the age of 40. The realm was plunged into immediate crisis. The heir, William's charge, was only 12 years old. What followed was the most infamous coup in English history. The late king's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, intercepted the young prince on his way to London. He arrested the boy's Woodville relatives. He placed the boy in the Tower of London for his protection. William Stanley watched in horror from the sidelines. He was a Yorkist, yes, but his loyalty was to the boy king, Edward V. He saw Richard of Gloucester systematically dismantle the boy's future. Richard declared the boy illegitimate, claiming Edward IV's marriage was invalid. In July 1483, Richard crowned himself King Richard III. The princes in the Tower, Edward V and his younger brother Richard, were never seen playing in the gardens of the Tower again. For William Stanley, this was a profound betrayal. He had spent years serving the boy, who was now likely buried under a staircase. Richard III was a usurper, a man who devoured his own kin. But William was also a Stanley. He did not rush to rebellion. He did not draw his sword immediately. He remembered the lesson of Blore Heath. He remembered the sting of being an outlaw. So Sir William Stanley did what his family did best. He bowed to Richard III. He attended the coronation. He smiled the thin, cold smile of a courtier. But behind the smile, he was calculating. Richard III had alienated the southern gentry. The realm was uneasy. Whispers of the murdered princes were poisoning the king's reputation. And across the narrow sea in Brittany, a ragged, penniless exile named Henry Tudor was gathering a mercenary army. This was the crucible of William's character. Outwardly, he was the loyal subject, even accepting new grants from Richard III. Inwardly, he was a man burning with suppressed rage and a cold desire for retribution. He had to walk a razor's edge, dining with the man he believed murdered his foster son. It required a supreme level of self-control, a duplicity that perhaps hardened his heart. He learned to separate his face from his soul, becoming an inscrutable mask of compliance while his mind plotted the destruction of the regime. This dual existence, the loyal servant by day, the conspirator by night, became his way of life. As the political skies darkened over England in 1483, the time for diplomacy began to bleed into the time for war. William Stanley had navigated the treacherous currents of the court with a steward's care, but the usurpation of Richard III forced his hand from the velvet glove to the iron gauntlet. The uneasy peace that had allowed him to amass his fortune was shattering, and the stage was shifting from the castles of the north to a muddy field in Leicestershire. The man who had spent a lifetime calculating the odds was about to find himself in a situation where silence was no longer a survival strategy, but a death sentence. If the early years of the Wars of the Roses taught William Stanley the art of survival, the reign of Richard III taught him the necessity of silence. From 1483 to 1485, England held its breath. The king, Richard III, was a capable administrator and a brave soldier, but his throne sat on a foundation of rumors. The shadows of his missing nephews, the princes in the Tower, stretched long over his court. For the Stanley family, this was the most dangerous game of chess they had ever played. Their position was uniquely perilous. William's brother, Lord Thomas Stanley, was married to Lady Margaret Beaufort. Margaret was the mother of Henry Tudor, the exiled Lancastrian claimant currently plotting an invasion from France. This meant the Stanleys were legally bound to the king, but tied by blood and marriage to his greatest enemy. Richard III was not a fool. He knew the Stanleys were the key to the north, and he knew they were untrustworthy. He kept them close, watching them with the unblinking gaze of a hawk. By the summer of 1485, the invasion was no longer a rumor. It was a reality. Henry Tudor landed at Milford Haven in Wales with a ragtag army of French mercenaries, Scottish exiles, and Lancastrian diehards. As Henry marched east, gathering support, the moment of truth arrived for William Stanley. King Richard summoned his lords to muster at Leicester. He sent specific threatening commands to the Stanleys: bring your men to fight for your king or face the consequences. William Stanley had been appointed the Chamberlain of North Wales by Richard, a position meant to secure his loyalty. Instead, William used it to allow Henry Tudor safe passage through the rugged Welsh terrain. This was his first act of treason in 1485. He did not join Henry openly, that would be suicide if Henry lost, but he did not stop him. He played the shadow game, marching his troops parallel to the invader, always just out of sight, sending secret messages promising support but committing nothing to paper. The king, realizing the treachery afoot, played his trump card. He seized Lord Strange, the eldest son of Thomas Stanley. He held the boy hostage, sending a chilling ultimatum to the Stanley camp. I have your son. If you do not join my battle line, he will be beheaded before the battle begins. It was here that the difference between the two brothers became stark. Thomas Stanley, paralyzed by the threat to his son and his natural caution, stalled. He sent the famous icy reply, "Sire, I have other sons." It was a bluff of supreme cruelty, designed to buy time. William, however, had no son to lose, and he had something his brother lacked: a killer instinct. On the morning of August 22, 1485, the armies converged on a marshy expanse of land near Market Bosworth. It was a day that would decide the fate of the nation, yet it began in eerie silence. The geography of the battlefield tells the story of the betrayal. King Richard's army, the largest force, took the high ground on Ambion Hill. Henry Tudor's smaller force stood on the plain below, dangerously exposed. But there was a third army. To the north and south of the battlefield, watching from the sidelines like spectators at a tournament, stood the Stanley forces. Thomas Stanley commanded roughly 4,000 men. Sir William Stanley commanded his own private army of 3,000 men. They were clad in red livery, emblazoned with the badge of the Hart's head. They did not unfurl their banners for Richard. They did not unfurl them for Henry. They simply stood, arms crossed, watching the sun rise. For Henry Tudor, this was terrifying. He was outnumbered 2-1 by the king. If the Stanleys joined Richard, Henry would be dead within the hour. If they stayed neutral, he would likely be ground down by Richard's superior numbers. He needed them to charge. Richard III, gazing down from the hill, was apoplectic with rage. He ordered the execution of the hostage, Lord Strange, though his orders were ignored in the confusion. He watched William Stanley's troops, men he had paid for, men from lands he had granted, standing idle. The battle began with a roar of cannons and a storm of arrows. The infantry lines crashed together in the marshland. It was a brutal, grinding melee. Henry Tudor's vanguard, commanded by the veteran Earl of Oxford, fought with desperate courage, forming a wedge that drove into Richard's lines. But sheer numbers began to tell. Richard's army was pushing back. The Tudor cause was wavering. From his vantage point, King Richard spotted an opportunity to end the war instantly. He saw Henry Tudor's standard waving in the distance, guarded by only a small retinue. Henry had ridden close to the front to urge his men on, exposing himself. Richard was a warrior king, the last of the Plantagenets. He did not wait for his generals. He lowered the visor of his helmet, gathered his elite household cavalry, the finest knights in England, and spurred his white courser forward. God and St. George! The charge was terrifying. Like a thunderbolt, Richard's cavalry smashed through Henry's protective ring. Richard himself drove his lance through Henry's standard-bearer, William Brandon, killing him instantly. He unhorsed the giant Sir John Cheney. He was feet away from Henry Tudor. Henry, who was no soldier, was fighting for his life, his sword arm weary, death staring him in the face. This was the moment, the tipping point of history. Thomas Stanley, the older brother, still did not move. He was watching the main battle lines, but William Stanley was watching the king. William saw the isolated cavalry charge. He saw the king exposed, separated from his main army by the chaos of the fight. He saw Henry Tudor, moments from death. If Henry died, William would be executed as a traitor for his delay. He didn't wait for a signal. He didn't consult his brother. Charge! Sir William Stanley led his 3,000 men in red livery down the hill. They did not join the main grinding battle. They flanked the king's desperate charge. It was a tactical masterstroke. They hit the side of Richard's cavalry formation like a sledgehammer. The impact was catastrophic for the king. The Yorkist knights were surrounded, pulled from their horses, and butchered. The men of William Stanley flooded the area, overwhelming the royal guard. In the center of the press, King Richard III fought like a demon. Accounts say he refused to flee, shouting "Treason, treason," as the Stanley men closed in. But courage could not stop the numbers. He was hacked down, his helmet beaten into his skull, his body pierced by halberds. The last Plantagenet king died not by the hand of Henry Tudor, but under the weapons of the man he had once trusted, Sir William Stanley. Silence fell over the field as the news of the king's death spread. The Yorkist army disintegrated. In the aftermath, the field was a scene of horror. But amidst the carnage, a ritual of immense symbolism took place. The golden circlet, the battle crown that Richard had worn over his helmet, was found. Legend says it was discovered under a hawthorn bush, battered and stained. Tradition holds that it was not Thomas Stanley who picked it up, but William. He walked over to where Henry Tudor stood, dazed, mud-splattered, and scarcely believing he was alive. William Stanley, the man who had turned the tide, knelt in the mud. He raised the crown and placed it on Henry's head. "God save King Henry," he roared. The army took up the cry. In that instant, the Tudor dynasty was born. And in that instant, William Stanley became the second most powerful man in England. He was the kingmaker. He had personally delivered the throne to an exile. In the weeks and months that followed, the rewards flowed like wine. King Henry VII, now the ruler of England, knew he owed his life to William Stanley. William was appointed Lord Chamberlain of the household. This was the pinnacle of courtly power. He controlled access to the king's person. He held the keys to the royal apartments. He was the man who slept nearest to the king. His wealth exploded. To his already vast estates, the king added new lands seized from Richard's fallen supporters. William Stanley's income soared to £3,000 a year, millions in today's currency. He lived in opulence that rivaled the monarch. He rebuilt his castles, commissioned magnificent tapestries, and maintained a retinue of liveried servants that looked more like a private army. He was untouchable. He was the hero of Bosworth. He was the king's beloved counselor. However, we must understand what it meant to be Lord Chamberlain. It was not just a title. It was a physical proximity that bred dangerous familiarity. William Stanley was the man who vetted the king's visitors, who stood by his chair during council meetings, and who often shared the private spaces of the royal suite. He saw Henry VII not just as a monarch, but as a man, vulnerable, anxious, and deeply suspicious. This intimacy can breed contempt. William began to see the cracks in the Tudor armor. He saw a king who was perpetually afraid, a king who ruled by ledger and spycraft rather than by charisma. For a man like William, who valued the martial glory of figures like Edward IV, Henry VII must have seemed dour and uninspiring. William grew to believe that he was the power behind the throne, forgetting that the man sitting on it was a master of survival. but there was a poison in the chalice. King Henry VII was a cold, calculating man. He had spent half his life in exile, looking over his shoulder. He trusted no one. As he sat on his new throne, watching William Stanley parade through the court in velvet and gold, Henry didn't just feel gratitude. He felt fear. He remembered that William Stanley had betrayed Henry VI. He remembered that William Stanley had betrayed Richard III, and he knew that a man who can make a king can also unmake one. William Stanley thought he was a partner in the new regime. He did not realize that he was merely a loose end. He had become an overmighty subject, too rich, too powerful, and dangerously unpredictable. For 10 years, William basked in the sun of his own success. He grew comfortable. He grew arrogant. He believed his position was unassailable because he was the man who had placed the crown on the king's head. Yet the laurels of victory can often become a blindfold. For a decade following Bosworth, William Stanley sat atop the Tudor world, insulated by his vast wealth and the king's apparent gratitude. But while he feasted in the light of his own success, the shadows of the dynasty he helped destroy were lengthening. The peace he had bought with his sword was about to be tested not by another army, but by a whisper from across the sea, a ghostly echo of the very princes he had once sworn to protect. The kingmaker had survived the battlefield, but he was unprepared for the quieter, deadlier war of conspiracy that was about to arrive at his doorstep. For 10 years, Sir William Stanley stood at the right hand of the king. He was the Lord Chamberlain, the gatekeeper of the Tudor court, and the richest subject in the realm. But while William basked in the glow of his golden age, the past refused to stay buried. In 1491, a rumor began to drift across the English Channel, a whisper that carried the chill of the grave. Travelers returning from Ireland and Burgundy spoke of a young man, roughly 17 years old, who held court with the grace of a prince. He wore silk, he spoke perfect, courtly English, and he bore a haunting, impossible resemblance to the late King Edward IV. His name, the rumor said, was Richard, Duke of York. He was the younger of the two princes in the Tower. The story went that he had not been murdered by his uncle Richard III, but had been spared by a merciful assassin and smuggled to safety. Now he was coming home to claim his birthright. To history, this young man is known as Perkin Warbeck, a boatman's son from Tournai, but to the terrified court of Henry VII, he was simply the Pretender. And to Sir William Stanley, he was a ghost that would demand a terrible reckoning. Why did this specific impostor rattle William Stanley? To understand this, we must remember the connection established in the early days. William Stanley had not just been a soldier for the House of York, he had been the steward to the Prince of Wales. He had lived in the household of the royal children. He knew their faces, their mannerisms, their voices. He had watched them grow. When descriptions of the Pretender reached London, they didn't just sound like a political threat. They sounded like a memory. The young man was described as having one eye slightly lower than the other, a trait of the Yorkist line. He had the charm, the wit, and the specific knowledge of court life that a boatman's son should not possess. For William Stanley, a seed of doubt was planted. What if? What if the boys he had served were not dead? If this young man was truly the son of King Edward IV, the king who had made William a Titan, then William was currently serving a usurper. His honor, dormant for so long, began to wrestle with his survival instinct. It is here that we see the tragedy of William's character. He was a man haunted by the original sin of Bosworth. He had betrayed the Yorkist line to put Henry on the throne, justifying it because he thought the princes were dead. But if one was alive, his justification crumbled. The Warbeck boy was supported by William's former ally, Margaret of Burgundy, Edward IV's sister. The pressure on William's conscience must have been immense. He was not a natural traitor. He was a man trying to find a moral center in a chaotic world. His hesitation, his listening to the rumors, was not born of malice toward Henry, but of a desperate hope that the past could be undone, that the boy he once protected had survived. King Henry VII was many things, but he was not naive. He knew his throne was fragile. As the Warbeck conspiracy gained support from the kings of France and Scotland, Henry realized he was facing a global coalition designed to destroy him. But Henry's true fear was not the enemy without, it was the enemy within. He knew that Warbeck could never invade England successfully unless he had support from the English nobility, men inside the king's own circle. Henry unleashed his spy network. He turned England into a police state. Agents whispered in taverns, servants were bribed to spy on their masters, and letters were intercepted. The king was hunting for the secret Yorkists in his court. He found the weak link in Sir Robert Clifford. Sir Robert Clifford was a trusted knight who had gone to Flanders to investigate the pretender. Once there, he had seemingly defected, declaring that Warbeck was indeed the true Duke of York. King Henry, playing a game of 4D chess, secretly reached out to Clifford. He offered him a full pardon and a massive bribe of £500, a fortune, if he would return to England and name the co-conspirators. Clifford, realizing the rebellion was stalling, took the deal. In December 1494, shortly before Christmas, the trap was sprung. The scene, as recorded by chroniclers, was cinematic in its cruelty. King Henry summoned his council to the Tower of London. The mood was tense, the lords gathered unsuspecting. Then, Sir Robert Clifford was brought in. He knelt before the king begging for forgiveness. Henry, feigning benevolence, granted it, on the condition that Clifford reveal the names of the traitors. Clifford began to rattle off a list of names: priests, minor knights, friars. The council nodded. These were expendable men. Then Clifford paused. He looked across the room at the Lord Chamberlain, the man standing closest to the king. "And," Clifford said, his voice steady, "Sir William Stanley." The room went silent. It was an accusation so shocking that it seemed absurd. William Stanley, the hero of Bosworth, the man who put the crown on Henry's head? It was like accusing the king's own right hand of trying to strangle him. This betrayal by Clifford was personal. Clifford and Stanley were not strangers. They were colleagues who had moved in the same circles. Clifford knew Stanley's secrets, his doubts, and his private misgivings. It was this intimacy that made the accusation so damning. It wasn't a stranger pointing a finger. It was a friend exposing the private soul of a man who thought he was safe, speaking amongst his peers. The shock in the room was not just political. It was the social shock of seeing the inner sanctum of the court torn apart from within. King Henry initially refused to believe it. He reportedly told Clifford to be very careful, for if he slandered such a great man, he would pay with his life, but Clifford insisted. He provided the evidence. And this evidence is what makes the tragedy of William Stanley so poignant. There was no smoking gun. There were no letters signed, "I will kill the king." There was no stockpile of weapons found in Stanley's London home. The entire case rested on a single conversation. Years earlier, in a private moment of confidence, likely betrayed by a servant or Clifford himself, William Stanley had allegedly said, "If I knew for sure that the young man was King Edward's son, I would never bear arms against him." This is known as conditional treason. Analyze those words. They are not a declaration of war. They are a statement of conflicting loyalty. Stanley was saying that if the boy was the true heir, His conscience would not allow him to kill the son of his old master. To a modern mind, this is a man showing integrity. He is refusing to kill a rightful king. But in the Tudor court, conditional loyalty was the same as treason. The king demanded absolute blind obedience. To say I might not fight for you was the same as saying I will fight against you. Despite the weakness of the evidence, the king ordered William Stanley to be confined to his quarters. Then, the king's commissioners rode north. They galloped to Holt Castle, Stanley's impregnable fortress in Wales. They weren't looking for letters, they were looking for the ledger. When they broke open the vaults of Holt Castle, the commissioners were stunned into silence. They found £10,000 in ready cash, gold and silver coin, and jewels, plate, and chains of gold, estimated at another £10,000. The total value was roughly £40,000. To put this in perspective, the king's total annual revenue from all crown lands was roughly £15,000. William Stanley had nearly 3 years of the king's income sitting in his basement. He was richer than the state. The inventory of the items seized gives us a final heartbreaking glimpse into William's personality. Among the treasures were collars of gold set with white roses, the symbol of the House of York, and rich vestments embroidered with his personal heraldry. These weren't just assets, they were mementos of a man who believed he was equal to the monarchy. He had hoarded the symbols of the dynasty he loved, York, while serving the dynasty he made, Tudor. It was this dual identity, materialized in gold and velvet, that condemned him. He had become a state within a state, and his treasury was a war chest that Henry VII could not ignore. We know from the great wardrobe accounts exactly what kind of man William was. He did not live quietly. The inventory lists gowns of cloth of gold, black velvet buskins, and harnesses of gold for his horses. He possessed a looking-glass of silver gilt, a rare luxury that speaks to his vanity. He wanted to see himself in his finery. He also held a massive store of lead and iron, suggesting he was preparing for a long siege or perhaps a new construction project. He was a man deeply rooted in the material world, believing that if he built enough walls and hoarded enough gold, he would be safe. He was wrong. When the report of this wealth reached Henry VII, William Stanley's fate was sealed. The king was fighting a war on multiple fronts, and his treasury was empty. He needed money desperately. By executing Stanley for treason, the king could invoke the law of attainder. This meant every penny, every acre of land, and every cow owned by Stanley would legally become the property of the crown. The historian Polydore Virgil, writing shortly after, noted cynically that Stanley's wealth was sufficient to create an appetite for his death. The conditional treason gave the king the legal excuse. The £40,000 gave him the motivation. During the trial, which was little more than a formality, one voice was conspicuously absent: Thomas Stanley, the Earl of Derby, the older brother. Thomas was the king's stepfather, husband to the king's mother. He sat at the very heart of power. If anyone could have saved William, it was Thomas. He could have begged his wife, Margaret Beaufort, to intervene. He could have threatened to withdraw his support. But Thomas Stanley did what he had done at Blore Heath and what he had done at Bosworth. He calculated the odds. He saw that William was doomed. To speak up for a traitor would be to risk his own neck. So Thomas Stanley stayed silent. He watched his brother being fed to the wolves, preserving his own position and the Stanley earldom. It was the ultimate cold triumph of the Stanley doctrine. Survival above all, even blood. The accusation fell like a hammer blow, shattering the illusion of invincibility that had surrounded the Lord Chamberlain. With the king's warrant signed and the vaults of Holt Castle stripped bare, the transition from the most powerful man in England to a condemned prisoner was terrifyingly swift. As the doors of the Tower of London closed behind him, the roar of the battlefield seemed a lifetime away, replaced by the scratching of quills and the cold anticipation of the headsman's axe. The gambit of conditional loyalty had failed, and now the only currency left to pay was blood. When the final morning arrived, the silence of the tower was heavier than any battlefield. The waiting was over. Sir William Stanley prepared to face the end not as a warrior in the heat of combat, but as a calculated loss in a political ledger. Consider the visual contrast of this moment. 10 years earlier, this man had stood on a sun-drenched hill at Bosworth, his armor gleaming, holding the future of England in his hands. He had been the arbiter of kings, the divine instrument of justice. Now stripped of his garter robes, his chain of office gone, his titles erased, he was merely a condemned traitor, a problem to be solved by the stroke of steel. The tragedy of William Stanley is not just that he died, it is how he died. He was not killed in the heat of battle, amidst the glory of the charge he loved so well. He was killed by the scratching of a quill on parchment, by the cold bureaucracy of the dynasty he had created. In Tudor England, treason was usually punished with a theatrical horror, hanged, drawn, and quartered. The victim would be dragged by horses, strangled until nearly dead, castrated, disemboweled while still conscious, and finally chopped into 4 pieces. It was a punishment designed to obliterate the human form. But King Henry VII granted William Stanley a final grim favor, the mercy of the axe. Because of his noble blood and his past service, William was spared the butcher's knife. He would die like a gentleman. This mercy tells us everything we need to know about Henry VII's conflicted state of mind. He could not bring himself to torture the man who had saved his life, but he could not bring himself to let him live. The axe was the compromise, a clean death for a dirty business. As William was led out to Tower Hill, a crowd had gathered. They were silent. This was not the execution of a hated public enemy. This was the execution of a celebrity. The people of London knew who William Stanley was. They knew he was the hero of Bosworth. The cognitive dissonance was palpable. If the king can kill him, they thought, who among us is safe? William climbed the scaffold. He did not make a long, impassioned speech professing his innocence, nor did he beg for his life. The records suggest a stoic resignation. He knew the rules of the game better than anyone. He had gambled on the conditional survival of the Yorkist line, and the house had won. He knelt in the straw. He placed his neck on the block, and with one heavy thud, the kingmaker was unmade. The moment the axe fell, the king's grief, if he felt any, was immediately replaced by his avarice. While William's body was still warm, the king's agents were already tearing apart his estates. The looting of Holt Castle and William's other properties was methodical and absolute. Henry VII was a meticulous accountant. He personally signed the pages of the royal ledgers. In the accounts following Stanley's death, we see the true motive laid bare. The king did not just confiscate the 40,000 pounds in cash, tens of millions in today's money. He took everything. He took the tapestries from the walls. He took the cattle from the fields. He took the rents from the tenants. He even took a specific chain of gold weighing 126 ounces that William had worn at court. Historians have long debated Henry VII's character. Was he a miser or was he a pragmatist? In the case of William Stanley, the line blurs. The confiscation of Stanley's wealth solved the crown's financial crisis overnight. The pretender, Perkin Warbeck, was still a threat, and wars cost money. In a cynical twist of fate, William Stanley's gold ended up funding the army that would eventually defeat the very prince William had refused to fight against. William Stanley inadvertently saved the Tudor dynasty twice, first with his sword at Bosworth, and second with his wallet after his death. The final insult came with the funeral. A man of William Stanley's stature, a Knight of the Garter, a Lord Chamberlain, a war hero, should have had a monument. He should have been buried in a marble tomb with an effigy depicting him in his armor, hands clasped in prayer, feet resting on a lion. Instead, King Henry VII authorized a payment of roughly £30, some sources say as low as £15, for his burial at Sion Abbey. It was a pauper's sum. The king who had seized a fortune gave back pennies for a shroud. There is no grand tomb for William Stanley today. His grave at Sion Abbey is lost, swept away by the dissolution of the monasteries decades later. The man who crowned a king has no marker. He was erased from the landscape of England as effectively as if he had never existed. And what of Thomas Stanley, the older brother, the Earl of Derby, the survivor? Thomas was now an old man. He had watched his brother die and had done nothing to stop it. The psychological toll of this must have been immense, even for a man as cold as Thomas. In the months following the execution, the king went out of his way to comfort Thomas. It was a macabre performance. The king visited Thomas at Latham House. They dined together. They hunted together. One can only imagine the tension at that dinner table. The king sat eating bread with the brother of the man he had just beheaded. And Thomas? He sat smiling, pouring wine for the man who had killed his sibling. Legend says that during this visit, the king's fool, Jester, whispered a warning to Henry VII. The king was standing near a precipice or a high window at Latham House, with Thomas Stanley behind him. The fool allegedly whispered, "Tom, remember Will," implying that Thomas might be tempted to push the king to his death in revenge, but Thomas did not push. He remained loyal, or perhaps terrified. He died in 1504, still an earl, still rich, and still safe in his bed. The Stanley doctrine of survival had worked, but the cost was the soul of the family. So, how do we judge Sir William Stanley? The Tudor historians, men like Polydore Virgil and later Shakespeare, who barely mentions him, painted him as a traitor. They focused on his betrayal. They called him unstable, greedy, and fickle. They needed to justify the king's actions, so they turned the hero into a villain. But if we flip the lens, a different image emerges. William Stanley was arguably the most consistent man in the Wars of the Roses. His loyalty wasn't to a king, it was to the people he knew. He fought for the Yorkists when they were rebels. He fought for the young Prince of Wales. He fought for Henry Tudor only when Richard III threatened the stability of the realm. And he died because he refused to promise to kill a boy who might be the son of his old friend. In a world of shifting alliances, his conditional treason was actually a moment of rigid morality. He drew a line in the sand. He said, "I will go this far, but no further." The tragedy is that he drew that line in front of a king who recognized no boundaries. Sir William Stanley was the ultimate kingmaker, but he forgot the golden rule of his own profession. Never let the king know that you have the power to unmake him. The blade that ended William Stanley's life did not, however, end his story. The silence that followed the thud of the axe on Tower Hill was heavy with implication, rippling out from the scaffold to the very foundations of the monarchy. While his body was consigned to a pauper's grave, the shockwaves of his execution began to reshape the psychological landscape of the Tudor reign. It turned a grateful king into a paranoid tyrant and left a legacy of mistrust that would haunt the dynasty for generations. The man was dead, but the question of what his death actually cost the soul of England was only just beginning to be asked. The axe that fell on William Stanley's neck did more than sever a head. It severed the bond of trust between the Tudor monarchy and the old nobility forever. The execution was a watershed moment. It signaled to every lord in England that the old rules of chivalry, where service bought safety and blood bought brotherhood, were dead. In the new world of Henry VII, the state was an icy machine, and no cog was too important to be replaced. But as the blood was scrubbed from the scaffold on Tower Hill, the ghost of William Stanley refused to vanish. His death cast a long, cold shadow that would stretch over the rest of the Tudor dynasty. William Stanley was the first high-profile victim of the Perkin-Warbeck conspiracy, but he was not the last. His execution bought Henry VII time and money, but it did not buy him peace of mind. In a cruel twist of irony, the wealth confiscated from Stanley, that massive hoard of £40,000, was used to fund the military campaign against Warbeck. When Warbeck finally landed in England in 1497, his rebellion fizzled out, not because of a lack of support, but because the king had the resources to outweight and outspend him. William Stanley's gold defeated the very boy he had died to protect. When Warbeck was captured, he was paraded through London. One wonders if, as he looked at the jeering crowds, he thought of the great Lord Chamberlain, who had gone to the block for a mere whisper of his name. Warbeck was eventually executed in 1499, hanged at Tyburn. The White Rose was finally crushed, but the psychological damage to Henry VII was permanent. The king retreated further into paranoia. If his best friend could betray him, who was left? He became a recluse, obsessed with ledgers and loyalty oaths. The execution of Stanley turned Henry from a warrior king into a miserly bureaucrat, counting his coins in the dark, forever waiting for the next knife in the back. History asks a fascinating question. Where did William Stanley's money go? We know Henry VII was a builder. He constructed the magnificent Henry VII Lady Chapel at Westminster Abbey, one of the most beautiful examples of perpendicular Gothic architecture in the world. Its fan-vaulted ceiling is a miracle of stone, delicate as lace. Historians have noted the timing. The construction of this chapel began in 1503, but the funds were accumulated in the years prior, the years immediately following the confiscation of the Stanley fortune. It is a haunting possibility that the beautiful chapel where Henry VII lies buried today was paid for by the liquidation of William Stanley's estate. The king rests in a tomb built with the plunder of the friend who gave him the crown. What of the family that remained? The House of Stanley did not fall with William. In fact, they demonstrated the terrifying resilience of their fence-sitting doctrine. Thomas Stanley, the Earl of Derby, died in 1504, his titles intact. He had swallowed his grief, or his shame, and remained loyal to the end. His descendants, the Earls of Derby, continued to rule Lancashire like petty kings for centuries. However, a subtle curse seemed to linger. The Tudors never fully trusted the Stanleys again. They were too powerful, too distant, and their history of king-making was too well remembered. In the reign of Elizabeth I, the Stanleys were constantly watched by spies. There were even plots, likely fabricated, suggesting that the Catholic powers of Europe wanted to place a Stanley on the throne to replace Elizabeth. Centuries later, during the English Civil War, the Stanleys would finally pick a losing side, the Royalists, and suffer the devastation they had avoided for so long. But in the immediate aftermath of 1495, the lesson was clear. The Stanleys would survive, but they would never again rise to the height where they could crown a king. William was the Icarus of the family. He flew too close to the sun, and his fall warned the others to stay close to the ground. History is defined by turning points, and the betrayal of William Stanley is one of the greatest what-ifs in British history. Consider the alternative. Suppose William Stanley had not been arrested in 1495. Suppose he had kept his silence until Perkin Warbeck landed in 1497. If Sir William Stanley, with his private army of 3,000 veteran soldiers and his vast wealth, had openly declared for Perkin Warbeck, the north of England would have risen with him. Henry VII, unpopular and miserly, might well have lost. The Tudor dynasty would have ended after a single king. There would be no Henry VIII, no Protestant Reformation in England, no Queen Elizabeth I, no Shakespearean plays celebrating the Tudors. England might have seen the restoration of the House of York under King Richard IV, Warbeck. The entire trajectory of the Western world, from the Church of England to the British Empire, would have been rewritten. William Stanley held the key to this alternate universe. Henry VII knew it. That is why he had to die. So how should we remember Sir William Stanley? He is often relegated to a footnote, a greedy turncoat in the saga of the roses. But this is a disservice to his complexity. He was a man caught between two ages. He was born into the medieval era, a time of personal oaths where a man's honor was tied to his feudal lord. He died in the early modern era, a time of absolute state power where the king was the state and loyalty was a legal contract. His mistake was not treachery, it was nostalgia. He thought the old rules still applied. He thought that because he had saved the king would love him. He failed to see that in the eyes of Henry VII, a man who has the power to save you also has the power to destroy you, and therefore he must be destroyed first. We return to the image of the battlefield at Bosworth, the red livery charging down the hill, the sun glinting off the gold circlet of England. William Stanley picked up the crown from a hawthorn bush and created a dynasty. 10 years later, that dynasty picked up an axe and erased him. It is the ultimate tragedy of power. The hand that gives the crown is always the first to be cut off.